Everyone says the eyes follow you in a painting, but in a wax museum, the eyes don't just follow, they judge. My name is Elias, and I'm the night watchman at the Gallery of the Macabre, a roadside attraction off Route 9 that should have gone bust in the 90s. I took the job because I was desperate. My private investigation license had been revoked after a case went wrong, and I needed cash that didn't involve questions. The owner, a frantic little man named Mr. Sterling, gave me the keys and a very strange handbook. It didn't have fire safety protocols or emergency contacts. It just had 3 rules scribbled in red ink on the first page. Rule 1. Keep the thermostat at exactly 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Never let it rise. Rule 2. Do not enter the Hall of Justice between 3 a.m. and 3:33 a.m. Rule 3. If a figure changes position, politely ask it to return to its pose. Do not touch it. I thought it was a joke to scare the new guy. The museum is divided into sections: Hollywood stars, historical figures, and the basement level, the Hall of Justice. It's creepy, sure. The smell of melting wax and old dust is everywhere. But for the first 2 nights, nothing happened. The figures stood still, frozen in their eternal shiny smiles. But on the 3rd night, the air conditioning unit sputtered and died. The temperature in the building began to climb. I was in the main lobby when I heard a sound coming from the basement stairwell. It sounded like sticky tape being peeled off a surface, a wet, tearing noise. I went down to check, flashlight in hand. The Hall of Justice was filled with figures of famous criminals and their victims, but as I swept my light across the room, I stopped on a figure I hadn't noticed before. It was a man in a gray suit kneeling, with a look of absolute terror on his face. I stepped closer. The detail was impossible. The sweat on the figure's forehead looked wet. I leaned in to inspect the eyes, and that's when the figure blinked. It wasn't a mechanical twitch. It was a wet, human blink. And then, the wax lips parted with a sticky sound, and a whisper escaped. Turn the AC back on, slipping on the polished concrete. My flashlight beam danced wildly across the room, illuminating the frozen, smiling faces of judges, executioners, and criminals. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice echoing in the silence. The figure didn't speak again. Its jaw hung slack, the wax around the mouth stretching like chewing gum as the room grew hotter. The thermostat on the wall beeped. 62 degrees. I didn't wait for an answer. I turned and sprinted for the maintenance closet on the upper level. If the AC didn't kick back on, whatever was happening down here was going to get worse. Mr. Sterling's rule wasn't about preservation, it was about containment. I reached the breaker box. My hands were shaking as I ripped the panel open. The fuse for the AC unit hadn't just blown, it had been physically removed and set on top of the box. Someone, or something, wanted the temperature to rise. I jammed the fuse back in and flipped the switch. The heavy industrial hum of the compressor roared to life, vibrating the floorboards. I leaned against the wall, trying to slow my heart rate. It was just a prank, I told myself. Sterling hired an actor to mess with me. I had to go back down. I had to prove it was a fake. I took the stairs slowly. The air in the Hall of Justice was still thick and humid, smelling faintly of honey and rot. I walked back to the spot where the kneeling man in the gray suit had been. He was still there, but he had moved. His hands, previously at his sides, were now covering his face, as if he were weeping. The wax on his fingers was softening, losing its definition. I stepped closer, anger replacing fear. "All right, show's over," I growled, reaching out to grab the actor's shoulder. My hand didn't hit a person, nor did it hit hard plastic. It sank into soft, warm sludge. The wax was melting rapidly. As it sloughed off the figure's neck, it revealed not a metal armature, but pale, human skin. And right there on the neck was a very distinctive birthmark. I froze. I knew this man. It wasn't a statue. It was City Councilman Miller, who had been reported missing on the news. Sticky residue from my hand on my pants. It was human oil. Councilman Miller was alive in there, or he had been moments ago. The blast of cold air from the vents was finally reaching the basement, and I watched in horror as the wax on Miller's neck began to solidify again, turning from translucent sludge back into a hard, shiny shell. His eyes, wide with panic, clouded over as a fresh layer of white film covered them. He was being refrozen. I grabbed my walkie-talkie. "Mr. Sterling, pick up! There's a body in the basement!" Static. Just dead. White noise. Then, a click. Not from the radio, but from the heavy metal door at the top of the stairs. The deadbolt slid into place with a final, echoing clang. I was locked in. I ran to the stairs and pounded on the door. "Let me out! Sterling!" "You broke rule number 3, Elias." Sterling's voice drifted through the metal, calm and muffled. "You touched the exhibits. You tainted the collection. Now you have to be processed." I spun around, my back to the locked door, facing the shadowy Hall of Justice. The cold was settling in, but the heat had done its damage. Miller wasn't the only one affected. The exhibits weren't just statues, they were a gallery of missing people. But as my flashlight swept to the far end of the room, I realized something worse. Some of these figures weren't victims. The exhibit labeled, "The Butcher," a hulking figure holding a cleaver began to twitch. The wax on its face didn't melt, it cracked. With a sound like a gunshot, the wax shell on its right arm shattered, sending shards flying. A hand, huge, red, and skinless, punched through the casing. It gripped the rusted cleaver, which I had assumed was a prop, and lifted it. The thing inside wasn't a person being preserved. It was something that had been waiting, gurgling sound because it had no lips. It swung the rusted cleaver, and the blade sparked against the concrete inches from my face. I scrambled on my hands and knees, weaving through the maze of frozen figures. The butcher wasn't human. It was a mass of raw, red muscle that had been barely contained by the wax shell. It moved with a jerky, unnatural speed, shedding flakes of white wax like dandruff as it hunted me. "Stay back!" I yelled, throwing a heavy brass stanchion at it. The metal pole bounced off the creature's chest with a dull thud. It didn't even flinch. The air conditioning was blasting now, turning the basement into an icebox. I could see my breath. The cold was my only ally. I noticed the butcher's movements were becoming stiffer. The raw muscle was reacting to the freeze, tightening up, but it was still too fast. It cornered me against the electric chair exhibit, raising the cleaver for a killing blow. I braced myself for the impact, closing my eyes, but the blow never came. A loud wooden crack echoed through the hall. It sounded like a gunshot, but deeper. I opened my eyes. The butcher was frozen mid-swing, but not by the cold. A thick, wax-covered rope had whipped around its neck, pulling it backward. I looked toward the center of the room. The exhibit labeled, "The Hanging Judge," had left his podium. He was tall, dressed in 19th century robes, and his face was a smooth, featureless oval of pale wax. He held the other end of the rope with impossible strength. The faceless head turned slowly toward me, and a voice projected directly into my mind, sounding like grinding stones. "The trial has not commenced," but the air conditioning was doing its job. The raw muscle turned purple, then gray, as the frost bit into it. With a final, agonizing crunch, the monster froze solid, trapped once again in a prison of its own hardened flesh. The hanging judge didn't let go of the rope. He stood tall and terrifying, his faceless head radiating an aura of absolute authority that chilled me more than the AC. "Sit," the voice in my head commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto a wooden bench near the Wild West display. Around me, the Hall of Justice shifted. The figures that I thought were passive observers, the pilgrims, the soldiers, the politicians, began to move. They didn't attack. They shuffled stiffly, their wax joints grinding. To form a circle around me, they were the jury. "Mr. Sterling is a negligent warden," the judge's psychic voice echoed, vibrating against my skull. "He allows the heat to rise. He allows the monsters to wake. He is unfit." I realized then that this wasn't just a haunted museum. It was a supermax prison for things that couldn't be killed, only frozen. And I was the only living thing in a room full of nightmares that were waking up from a long nap. "I'm just the guard," I yelled, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "I didn't know. Let me out, and I'll never come back." The judge tilted his head. The smooth, blank wax where his face should be seemed to ripple. "You cannot leave, Elias," the judge intoned. "The position of warden must be filled by a living soul. The pact requires a heartbeat to keep the seals frozen." He pointed a long, waxen finger toward the heavy iron door at the top of the stairs, the one Sterling had locked. "Mr. Sterling has resigned. Look." I looked up at the door's small observation window. Pressed against the glass, eyes wide and unseeing, the small observation window. Sterling's severed head was stuck there, frozen to the glass by his own blood. He hadn't been killed by a monster. He had been executed by the museum itself for trying to abandon his post. "The collection must be curated." The judge's voice grated in my mind, devoid of sympathy. Sterling was weak. He let the frost thaw. He tried to run. The pact does not allow for resignation. I shivered violently, hugging my chest. The temperature was dropping fast, probably in the 20s now. My breath came in jagged, white clouds. "I'll freeze to death down here," I stammered, my teeth chattering. "I'm human. I can't survive this cold." "Precisely," the judge replied. The faceless figure stepped closer, towering over me like a monolith of justice. "The warden must be warm. The warden is the heartbeat that keeps the stasis active. If you die, the frost breaks. If the frost breaks, they all wake up." He gestured to the hundreds of figures standing in the darkness, serial killers, tyrants, nightmares given form. They were all vibrating slightly, waiting for the temperature to rise just 1 degree so they could shed their shells and finish what they started centuries ago. I accept," I lied, desperate. "I just needed him to open the door." I'll be the warden. Just let me go upstairs to get my coat and tools. The judge paused. The air in the room grew heavy, pressing down on me. Your tools are here, warden, and your first task begins now. He turned and pointed a long, waxen finger toward the far back of the hall to a small, reinforced iron door I had never noticed before. It was painted black, but the center of the metal was glowing cherry red. Something behind it was generating intense heat, fighting against the museum's cold. Something has breached the incinerator room, the judge said. It is burning through the containment. Go, warden, seal the breach before it melts the foundation. The wax figure of a 1920s firefighter stepped forward and handed me a heavy, rusted fire axe. The judge leaned down, his blank face inches from mine. And be careful, he whispered. The thing inside isn't shimmering around me. The change in temperature was violent. The sweat on my skin froze and then instantly melted again as I got closer to the black iron door. I gripped the handle of the rusted fire axe, silently thanking the wax firefighter who had given it to me. I kicked the door open. The incinerator room was a hellscape of steam and noise. In the center of the room, wrapped around the main coolant pipe like a parasitic tumor, was the breach. The judge was right. It was made of teeth. It looked like a crab the size of a lawnmower, but its shell was a mosaic of thousands of human molars, canines, and wisdom teeth fused together. It was gnawing on the metal pipe with a sickening crunch, crunch, crunch sound, trying to rupture the line and flood the museum with hot steam. Get away from there, I yelled, swinging the axe with everything I had. The creature spun around with blinding speed. It had no eyes, just a central vertical slit of a mouth filled with rows of jagged, yellowing fangs. It shrieked, a sound like a dentist's drill hitting a nerve, and lunged at me. I brought the axe down. Keelak. The blade didn't cut. It shattered against the creature's enamel armor, sending metal shards flying across the room. The impact jarred my arm so hard I dropped the handle. The creature slammed into my chest, knocking me onto the hot metal grating of the floor. It pinned me down, its sharp, calcified legs digging into my shoulders. I stared up into its maw, waiting for it to bite my face off. The heat from the incinerator behind it was unbearable. But the creature didn't bite. It stopped, hovering inches from my nose. It chattered its teeth together, creating a rhythmic, clicking speech that sounded like hail on a tin roof. You are not wax. It clicked. You are meat. Why do you fight for the jailer? Do you not know what powers the cold? The creature stepped aside, revealing the open door of the furnace behind it. I looked inside. The fire wasn't burning coal or gas. It was burning evidence. Stacks of missing person files, bloody clothes, and a small, pink sneaker that looked exactly like the one my daughter was wearing the day ignoring the blistering heat, and snatched the small pink sneaker before it could turn to ash. It was charred and smelling of melted rubber, but I knew it. I had tied the laces on this shoe 3 years ago. I held it to my chest, a scream dying in my throat. The creature made of teeth backed away, its clicking voice softer now. The judge does not serve justice, Elias. He serves silence. He freezes the truth so the world forgets. It all made sense. The Hall of Justice wasn't a prison for monsters. It was a vault for the sins of the powerful. Councilman Miller wasn't a statue. He was a witness silenced by wax. And my daughter, she wasn't just missing. She had been erased, her belongings fed to this furnace to power the very magic that hid her fate. I wasn't the warden. I was the janitor for a graveyard of secrets. Sterling knew, I whispered, the rage burning hotter than the incinerator. He kept the machine running. Sterling was weak. The creature clicked. But you are angry. Break the ice, warden. Let the truth thaw. I looked at the heavy coolant pipe the creature had been gnawing on. It was vibrating, pumping liquid nitrogen through the walls to keep the exhibits frozen and docile, to keep the judge in power. I stood up. I didn't feel the cold anymore. I picked up the heavy iron head of the fire axe that had shattered against the creature's shell. It was useless as a blade, but perfect as a hammer. Judge? I screamed, my voice carrying through the vents back to the main hall. Court is adjourned. I raised the iron lump high above my head and brought it down on the main valve of the coolant pipe. It didn't break on the first hit, or the second, but on the third strike, the metal groaned and sheared off. A geyser of liquid nitrogen exploded into the room, freezing the air instantly. But more importantly, the hum of the compressors died. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by a sound coming from the hall above, the sound of 1,000 wax figures rapidly filling with freezing fog. But I ran through it, back toward the Hall of Justice. The heat was rising fast. The air smelled of ozone, ancient dust, and the sickly sweet scent of melting honey. The silence of the museum was gone. It was replaced by a cacophony of wet, tearing sounds, like 1,000 bandages being ripped off at once. I burst into the main hall. It was a scene of absolute nightmare. The wax shells of the exhibits were splitting open. Shards of painted wax fell to the floor like broken porcelain. From within the debris, people were emerging. Some were confused, gasping for air as their lungs reinflated. Others, the monsters, were roaring with a hunger that had been suppressed for decades. In the center of the chaos stood the hanging judge. He was trembling. The perfect, smooth oval of his face was sagging. A mouth was tearing open in the wax, revealing a black void beneath. He held his gavel up, slamming it against the podium in a frantic rhythm. "Order!" the psychic voice screamed, causing my nose to bleed. "Order in the court. The accused is guilty of treason. Seize him!" He pointed his melting finger at me. To my left, the executioner, a massive figure in a black hood holding a great axe, stepped forward. He shook off the last pieces of his wax casing. He looked at me, his eyes dark and hollow. "He killed the cold!" the judge shrieked. "Kill him and I will grant you sleep." I stood my ground, gripping the heavy iron axe head. I held up the small, charred pink sneaker. "He didn't grant you sleep," I yelled, addressing the room, not the judge. "He granted you silence. He burned the truth to keep you frozen. He is not the law. He is the criminal." The executioner stopped. He looked at the sneaker in my hand. Then he looked at the pile of ash near the incinerator vent. He turned his hooded head slowly back toward the judge. "I have no daughter," the executioner rumbled, his voice like gravel grinding together. "But I remember why I was frozen. I killed the man who hurt my family." He turned fully toward the judge, raising the massive great axe. "And I think I missed one." The judge tried to back away, but he bumped into the jury. The 12 figures weren't sitting anymore. They were standing, and they were all holding pieces of the shattered wax shells like shit. It was the sound of tectonic plates grinding together, a frequency that shattered the glass display cases in the lobby upstairs. I watched as the executioner brought the great axe down, cleaving the judge's podium in two. The jury descended on him, tearing at his melting robes with hands that were regaining their color and warmth. They didn't kill him. They dismantled him. The judge wasn't a man. Beneath the robes and the melting wax, he was nothing but black sludge and old court documents, a golem made of bureaucracy and malice. As the mob tore him apart, the sludge seeped into the floor drains, vanishing into the earth. The heat in the room was now suffocating. The fire from the incinerator had spread to the walls. The museum was dying. I didn't run. I walked over to the chaotic pile of debris near the judge's podium. Lying there, untouched by the flames, was a heavy iron ledger, the docket. I grabbed it and shoved it into my jacket. Then I walked out. I passed the executioner, who was leaning on his axe, watching the fire consume the hall. He nodded to me once, a silent thank you from one father to another. I burst out of the front doors just as the roof of the gallery of the Macabre collapsed inward. The rush of oxygen fed the inferno, turning the roadside attraction into a pillar of fire visible for miles. Sirens wailed in the distance. The police found hundreds of bodies in the ruins. They called it the single greatest mass grave discovery in state history. Identification took months. Families finally got answers. Councilman Miller was identified by his dental records. I never told them about the monsters. I never told them that some of the bodies walked away into the woods before the fire trucks arrived. I sat in my car that night and opened the iron ledger. It contained names, dates, and locations. It was a list of every soul the judge had frozen to cover up the crimes of the powerful. On page 42, I found her, Sarah. It listed her not as an exhibit, but as acquired. She hadn't suffered. The entry said she was too bright to freeze, so they had let her go, not free, but passed on. The sneaker in the furnace was just a cruelty, a tether to keep me investigating. I didn't find my daughter, but I found peace. She wasn't trapped in the wax, and I certainly don't work security. But I kept the ledger. There are names in this book that haven't been crossed out yet. Powerful names. People who used the judge to hide their sins. The gallery is gone, but the clients who built it are still out there. I bought a new axe today. It's not for wood. It's for breaking the ice. If you see a man in a gray coat standing outside your window at night, don't worry. I'm just checking to see if you're warm or if you need to be melted down.